Can you envision a world where you and your family in America and those who immigrated from Africa and the Caribbean could receive immersive financial education and invest in fractional and whole shares of U.S. publicly traded companies? That time has come. Wekeza. Finally, from your mobile phone, you can start investing in building wealth. Wekeza. Just sign up for the Wekeza app and join the Wekeza community to receive ongoing adult and youth financial education from licensed advisors. Wekeza. You become a financially educated and protected investor. Wekeza has one empowering objective: creating financial inclusion and your family's generational wealth for the African diaspora. Wekeza.
And hello and welcome back to Planet Wekeza. What does Wekeza mean? It means save and invest in Swahili. Hello, I'm Sabrina Lamb, the founder and CEO of Wekeza, as well as World of Money, the leading provider of youth financial education for ages 7 to 18 in the United States and 4 African countries. Here at Wekeza, we have very important, crucial, urgent conversations moving wealth, business, entrepreneurship, finances into and front and center in our lives, because financial education and wealth building is part of the African diaspora and culture. Today, we uncover the history behind America's racial wealth gap with Arizona State history professor Calvin Schermerhorn, a leading expert on the economic history of race in America. His new book, which debuts today, The Plunder of Black America: How the Racial Wealth Gap was made. He reveals how Black Americans were systematically dispossessed of wealth, not through mismanagement, but through deliberate exclusion. From the early days of enslavement to modern policies like redlining and predatory lending, each shift in the American economy has denied Black communities the ability to build generational prosperity. Through powerful stories like Anthony Johnson, a Black landowner whose property was stolen in colonial Virginia, and how the thief that stole the land, how their descendants have prospered, and the destruction of Tulsa's Black Wall Street. Professor Schermerhorn connects historical injustices to modern day financial inequality. Welcome, Professor Schermerhorn, to Planet Wekeza.
Thank you, Sabrina. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So my first question to you is why? Why have you dedicated your professional life to center on this subject, slavery, economic injustices as it relates to capitalism? Why this subject?
Why this subject? Thank you. When I was growing up in a military family, we moved from an air base in Germany to Southern Maryland in 1984. Before that, I was on an air base in Britain. And what I saw when I went to elementary school was a puzzle. Why was it that William's father picked up a mop and a bucket when he went to work? And why did my father pick up a briefcase? Why did Rhonda's mother have a service job? Why did my mother teach school? And it wasn't because of an absence of African-American professionals. Both my teacher and the principal were African-American women. But there was something about this environment in Southern Maryland that seemed to hide a story that nobody wanted to acknowledge. And as I went to high school, I went to college in that place, the story became more mysterious. I actually lived down the road. I didn't know it at the time, but I lived it right down the road from where some of the Georgetown enslaved people who were taken from Maryland and sold to Louisiana to keep Georgetown afloat in 1838, where they lived in St. Inigo's, Maryland. There were clues in the landscape. And so when I when I got interested in history, it was to try and uncover those clues. When I read Frederick Douglass, I thought, how many more Frederick Douglasses were out there whose voices did not reach our ears? And so as a historian, as a professional, I looked into the origins of enslavement in the Chesapeake, and then got interested in the afterlives of enslavement. And that's when things got interesting, because the historians will say, all right, well, here's this process of enslavement, and then what we have on the other side is freedom. But I think what we need were bigger categories than that, because freedom presupposes a little bit of economic fairness too, right? We talk about free markets, we talk about a free economy. This is supposed to be the fertile ground in which opportunity grows. So why hasn't it grown for African Americans? Of course, we can look at the history of Jim Crow and the history of systematic exclusions. But then people think, oh, well, there's a civil rights movement. That's 50 years in the past now. Shouldn't that have righted things? And so that piqued my interest. And so when we're thinking about issues of wealth and generational wealth, and how it takes a long time to build wealth, it can take a very short time to destroy wealth, those questions interest me. And so the Plunder of Black America is an attempt to go back and reconstruct that story through several African American families over that long period of time, to see how that process works and how that history fits together.
Thank you for that. And I'm always curious about word usage. I rarely hear the word plunder. And as you indicated in the book, that you use that word, or you were inspired to include that word, from a quote from Frederick Douglass, who said once, "Men who live by robbing their fellow men of their labor and liberty have forfeited their right to know anything of the thoughts, feelings, or purposes of those whom they rob and plunder."
Correct.
Why did you use the word plunder?
Plunder gets to the heart of the matter. Plunder suggests ill usage. This is why Ta-Nehisi Coates' his work is so powerful when he uses the plunder of Black life. This is why Frederick Douglass's work is so powerful when he uses this word. We may think of an act like an act of piracy, of plunder. You can associate it with kind of Caribbean golden age of piracy. But what we're talking about when we talk about the plunder of intergenerational wealth are many quiet, sometimes loud, but mostly quiet acts of dispossession, disinheritance, decapitalization. The plunder can be as silent as an algorithm that denies credit to someone who deserves credit, but for whom the algorithm has trained to recognize this person as someone who has to pay more for that. That's an instance of plunder. Now we think, well, okay, well, that has maybe nothing to do with an overseer on a plantation holding a firearm or a whip and commanding obedience. But if we connect the process of wealth stripping, of the often violent and sometimes quiet method of denying income generating possibilities, and if we set those things up, then we can start to see the big picture. And that we have something more than just, well, there was slavery and then stopped. And then we have freedom. And then we have Jim Crow, but that stopped. And now we have freedom. And so in the Plunder of Black America, I tried to look at those places where Black families have recognized the obstacles and tried to overcome them.
And we're going to talk about the 8 families that you heavily research. I have my book here. It's dog-eared and Post-its and red and yellow highlights all the way through it. How and why did you choose Mary and Anthony Johnson? I want to lift their names. Venture, his name was Venture, and Meg Smith. Morris, Martha Bentley, Harriet and Jack Adams, the Rivers family, the Ragsdale, the Praetors. When there were so many silent plunders, why did you choose those? And they all kind of were around the area that you grew up in, that Maryland, Washington, D.C., Virginia area, although Harriet, she went to Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Correct. When I was doing research for this book, I wanted it to be more than just bad things happen. Okay, so what I was looking for were families who strove to overcome an obstacle only to see another obstacle spring up in their place. And so we start with Mary and Anthony Johnson. These were their adopted names on the eastern shore of Virginia. They were young people in what's today Angola, who were captured, taken down the Kwanzaa River Valley, branded by Portuguese merchants and sold to enslavers, taken on a slave ship across the Atlantic, who was intercepted by English pirates. And they landed in Virginia near the startup phase of the Virginia Project. And before a law of slavery, they were somewhere between a captive and an indentured servant. They'd never signed an indenture. They never agreed to be there, unlike so many other indentured servants. But they found a way out of no way. So faced with a high mortality rate, a very hostile environment, they somehow learned to earn income and generate wealth. And I think they did that by ranching livestock. And over years and years of ranching their own livestock, even while enslaved, they built up a nest egg. They moved to Virginia's eastern shore, and they traded their livestock for bound laborers, which meant land, and became tobacco planters. And so for a moment in the 1650s, here were Angolan, Kimbundu-speaking planters on the eastern shore of Virginia who were suing their white neighbors and winning in court when courts decided that the status of this family was more important than their appearance. Then they ran into obstacles. The British government, the Crown, the Parliament decided to change the rules of the colonial game and squeeze the colonists by making them export their tobacco directly to England rather than on the free market. And then their neighbors started buying other Angolans, other Kimbundu speakers from New Amsterdam, from Dutch merchants. And so all of a sudden, you look around, people who look like the Johnsons are now enslaved. And the colony starts to associate race with enslavement and starts to exclude them from the rights and privileges that they'd earned in the colony. So that by the time the patriarch Anthony Johnson died in 1670, he died without a will. The court decided that he was a Negro and by consequence an alien. That's the quote that they used. And that was the jurisprudence that allowed them to take his property. When just about everybody else in the colony who died without a will, they said, well, where's the nearest relative? Let's give that property to them. So the Johnsons had to essentially become refugees in Maryland. And when that didn't work out, they went to Delaware. The family was pushed to the margins. And this was a pattern that was set for generations.
But there was could you explain the head right system that was happening in Virginia at that time, as well as Mary, her original name, her birth name was Malala, coming from Angola. And then, as you said, her name was changed, that she and her husband purchased John Kazara. How did that work?
Yeah, so here, imagine, okay, so we're in 17th century colonial Virginia and Maryland. Land is plentiful, and we'll put aside for the moment whose land it was. Labor is scarce. And so the colony has this scheme to lure laborers by granting anyone who controls a bound laborer, anyone who owns a contract on an indentured servant or an enslaved person, the colony says you get 50 acres of land so long as you improve that land. You build a house, build a barn, grow some crops on that land. And so that was the way you got land. It wasn't worth so much, but the colony granted a head right of 50 acres to anyone with those bound laborers. So the challenge for Malala, Mary, and her husband Anthony was to assemble bound laborers and claim them as workers in order to get that land. And they were able to assemble 5 bound laborers. They may have counted themselves. They may have counted children. Anyone over 16 was considered a laborer. And if you could construe someone as owing a debt to you, then you could do that. Somehow they probably traded some livestock for title to an enslaved man, John Kaiser or John Kazara, whom they enslaved. And this was the stakes of their family strategy. Now, John Kazara turned around and said, "Hey, I'm not enslaved. I'm just an indentured servant from across the bay." And one of the neighbors from a family named Parker took his side and took the Johnson family to court. And Mary or Malala persuaded her husband to let him go and say, "Look, we don't need this. We don't need the trouble." And they said, "Okay, we'll let him go." But then Anthony Johnson recognizes a problem, which is that we're next. We look enslavable as well. And so then he went back to court and he asserted his ownership over John Kazara as an enslaved person. And he won that battle in court. The court recognized Anthony Johnson as planter first and black man second. Mm-hmm. And Kazara remained enslaved to Mary Johnson even after Anthony Johnson's passing. There's records of him in Maryland. He ranched cattle as well, and he registered a livestock brand, but he was still enslaved to her.
And the quote that you reference, the Judge John Stronger, said the reason why Anthony could not own or bequeath any land to anyone, to his family, or his land could not be given to his family, be given to a stranger. The quote was, Anthony was a Negro, any by consequence an alien, and for that cause the land doth its sheet, return to the state. Did that a couple of times in Anthony and Mary's life.
That's correct. And so that was Virginia jurisprudence. Okay, it's open and shut, and they use this term alien.
And 12 jurors as well.
Yes, yeah. And it was a court, right? It wasn't just the whim of one person. And so this is how racial wealth discrimination gets codified in law. It gets sewn into the jurisprudence of colonial America. Mm-hmm. And so if we can see that as a closing of a chapter of opportunity for families like the Johnsons to build wealth and pass it on to their children, then we can start to understand how wealth gains and wealth disparities grow. Because as everyone viewing this knows, wealth is a generational project. Why do we spend so much time worrying about our 403Bs, our accounts, our legacies, our retirements? What are we going to leave to the next generation? And so unlike something like voting rights, which presumably you can switch on, right? If people lack voting rights, in the next election, we're going to open the polls, or in the next election, we're going to close the polls to anybody who can't show the proper ID. These things are, we seem to be able to switch them on and off. Wealth is not like that. And so if we think about, excuse me, every dollar having a history, what is the history of your family wealth, of my family wealth? And then if we look at that over a long period of time, we can start to understand why it is we have such a tremendous wealth disparity by race in the United States today.
Mm-hmm. And before we move on and talk a little bit about Venture and Meg Smith, when I Googled the descendants of, first talk about George Parker, who received the land, some 200 acres, I believe it was, of Mary and Anthony Johnson's land, and how his descendants have prospered in that area. But when I Googled them, they don't mention anything, well, I kind of stole this land from Anthony and Mary.
Yeah, so this is the Parker family of Virginia's Eastern Shore. And they were hostile to the Johnson family and took them to court and abetted schemes to take their land. And then once the Johnson family land became Parker family property, it grew. It by the 18th century, there was this beautiful plantation. By the 19th century, the family had thousands and thousands of acres, enslaved people. They were growing a number of crops on the Eastern Shore, and their Parkers fought and died for the Confederacy. And so you see this trajectory from, they were in the startup phase of this colonial project too. And all things equal, the Johnsons and the Parkers may have been, rival landowners for generations, but that's not how it worked. The Johnsons ended up with zero in Virginia, zero land. The Parkers ended up with a fortune. And based on the jurisprudence of the court that took the Mary and Anthony Johnson's land, it wasn't because the Parkers were savvier business people. It was because it came down to race, right? You are an alien and therefore not eligible for this economic opportunity.
We're joined by Arizona State Professor Calvin Schermerhorn, who's the author of his groundbreaking book, which debuts today, The Plunder of Black America, How the Racial Wealth Gap Was Made. Talk a little bit about Brotour Furrow. That was his original name when he was enslaved in 1739 and kidnapped from Ghana. Brotour Furrow, who's the person that snatched him, changed his name to Venture, as he was an investment venture.
Yes, Brotour, this is a fascinating case. So here's somebody who grew up as the son of a nobleman in what I think and what scholars think is the far north reaches of Cameroon today. And so he was subject to a conquest, if you like, that put his father on the spot. And the conqueror came in and said, reveal your people's wealth and I'll spare your life. He said, I don't trust any promises that you make. And so Brotour saw his father murdered. He was soon kidnapped, separated from his family, marched about 1,000 miles to Ghana, to what's today Ghana and the coast, and sold to English enslavers who were coming from Rhode Island. And for a length of calico cloth and a measure of alcohol, he was bought and sold to a sailor named Mumford, who renamed him Venture, exactly as you say, Venture designating an investment. And so here's this boy, 10, 11 years old, now aboard a slave ship sailing across the Atlantic. The sailor Robinson Mumford decided, I'm not going to sell him in Barbados. I'm going to keep him and put him to work on Fisher's Island, which was the westernmost part of colonial New York, right off the coast of Stonington, Connecticut today. And so Brotour, now renamed Venture, grew up on this island, was made to do a number of very hard tasks. The Mumford children went to school or had tutors come to them, but Venture had to work and work very hard. Now, this Mumford family was an enterprising family of capitalists. They put a price on everything, and Venture soon learned that maybe if he could work a little bit extra over and above what they demanded of him, he could save up coins. He could eventually buy his freedom. On that island, on Fisher's Island, there were abundant resources to do that. He could trap fur animals, he could fish, he could garden in places where they didn't require, that he could grow crops on his own. And he met Meg, who was in the same position as he was, also enslaved, also could describe the smell of a slave ship as she was transported across the Atlantic. And together they cooperated. They got married. They tried to build a life. But when Meg became pregnant with their first daughter, Hannah, they realized the laws of New York or the laws of Connecticut construe this baby as property, as someone who's kinless, who's someone who's the ownership bond between the Mumfords and Meg's daughter was stronger than her claim to her daughter as a mother. And so Venture decided to flee for the Maspee River on Long Island, maybe a safe haven. That plan failed, and the owner, George Mumford, sold him to a Connecticut buyer. And this starts a cycle, a crisis cycle in the Venture and Meg Smith. They didn't call themselves Smith at the time, but the Venture and Meg family, where each person who gets his hands on Venture or Meg decides they're going to use them like a cash machine. They're going to hold out this prospect of freedom and say, oh, if you just work a little bit extra, earn money on the side, we'll sell this to you. And the Plunder of Black America tells this story because Venture very clearly remembered the value of things. And so I could go back and calculate how much value he created, how much he earned. And it turns out that he kept earning money for these enslavers who kept demanding more of him. And by the time that he became free and bought his kids, enslavers had drained about 66 years worth of income out of him. That is, he'd worked the equivalent of 66 years of an average New England family or an average New England earner, doing everything from fishing to selling produce to cutting wood by the cord to shipping wood to going to sea and going on this whaling expedition or this whaling voyage, this terrible whaling voyage from which he never really recovered, only to see that, in this cold New England economy, his wealth, his standing was extremely vulnerable. Now, historians have rightly celebrated Venture and Meg's achievement. They bought land up the Connecticut River. They had a home, they had acres, but compared to what they'd earned over a lifetime, this was a small fraction of the wealth they should have generated. And then in their old age, they had to eat that wealth. They had to sell off pieces and rely on their children. And so if you think about the success that they were able to achieve, there's also that tragedy that they should have achieved much more, because the people who enslaved them were the equivalent of millionaires today, who passed large sums of money to their children, or they passed the prestige of a home, of a business, in a place in which African Americans were not permitted to rise up the economic ladder.
What does Venture Smith's struggle to buy his family's freedom and to buy his children illustrate about the cost of Black determination in colonial America?
This is a wonderful question, because they had 5 children, and with each child now was the task to try to secure them, try to get them out of slavery, out of enslavement. And so it shows that every breath that Venture Smith drew was one that was filled with determination to keep his family together, to keep his children out of the clutches of enslavers. And when he had to go away to a season at a time to earn money, I mean, this was extremely painful, to be out of sight, to be unable to protect a wife and family from assaults, from predations inside a household, or from the chilly New England economy. In one case, he had, through his connections, gotten his son an apprenticeship with a shipping merchant named Church. And Church held out this promise of silver buckles to his son Solomon. Said, hey, if you sign up for this whaling voyage, when you come back, I'll give you the silver buckles. This wasn't what was supposed to happen. He was supposed to get an actual job with an actual upward, a chance, a toehold in the New England economy. And what Solomon didn't know, but what Venture did know, was that a whaling voyage came with a 50% mortality. And so once Venture found out that his son had signed on to this whaling voyage, he rushed to the port. He rushed to Church's office and said, what the heck is going on here? Reverse this. He didn't get a chance because he saw the ship leaving. And on that ship was Solomon, 16 years old, who came down with scurvy and died aboard this whaling voyage. And so this was heartbreaking. Solomon had already spent years and years of income freeing him from the enslaver's clutches, only to see this predatory move in this first kind of misplaced act of professional trust.
It just takes your breath away. Takes your breath away. Let's talk a bit about Morris. We're now in the 1754, and I love that you center on Morris as opposed to the person that we all know. Once you share about him and his life in Virginia in the 1754 around up to 1795. Could you talk about Morris?
Yeah, Morris was born in Newcastle County, Virginia in 1729. He was owned by a wealthy merchant and politico, John Custis IV, one of the most powerful men in Virginia. John Custis IV's son, Daniel Parke Custis, wanted to marry a beautiful teenage daughter of a planter named Martha Dandridge. Of course, John Custis did not like this, but he died in 1749, and Daniel Parke Custis married Martha Dandridge in 1750. And so Morris was a carpenter on their estate. It was called White House in New Kent County, and he was very good at what he did. He could join wood a dozen ways. He knew carpentry in and out. Now, in 1757, Daniel Parke Custis died without a will. Of course, Virginia didn't take his property. It went in thirds to Martha and their two surviving children. Now, Martha became the most wealthy widow in Virginia and attracted the attention of a young ex-officer, George Washington, who wanted to transition from militia colonel to planter. And so Washington married Martha. Martha Dandridge Custis became Martha Washington, and Morris, now called George Washington Master. So George Washington paid exactly zero for Morris, even though he was a skilled carpenter. He was in his 20s, and by the time he'd made the coffins for the Custis children who died of the same illness that Daniel Parke Custis did, he was no closer to getting married, getting paid, or getting free. So George Washington, recognizing his talents, moved him up to Mount Vernon, and where there was a great need for carpenters in Fairfax County, Virginia, and some of the work on Mount Vernon that still exists was performed by Morris. Now, Washington didn't reward Black capabilities, but he did recognize it. And so he decided to promote Morris to the overseer of one of his farms. Now, when George Washington owned Mount Vernon, he was creating kind of a diversified agribusiness. And Mount Vernon had 5 working farms. George Washington didn't want to grow tobacco like the Custis family. He wanted to diversify. So once he recognized that Morris could do the job of a white overseer, he had a good thing going, because he didn't pay Morris anything. I mean, he paid him a stipend, about 1/10 what he paid for a white overseer. And for that, Morris could live with his wife, Hannah. Washington only let about 1/3 of married couples on Mount Vernon live together because it was just inefficient, right? You don't want people who are working on different parts of the estate having to live under one roof, right? That was not good for management. So Morris got the management job. He was in charge of about 13 enslaved people, and he was the face of their enslavement. And so Morris toiled for 20 years, making this part of Mount Vernon run smoothly. He was in charge of assigning work, of accounting how many hogs were slaughtered, how much herring had been distributed, how many apples were picked, were the tools in good order, who was pregnant, who was nursing, who was sick, who was able to do this or that. And so Washington came to depend on him. In his records, he wrote down, he didn't call the farm what he had called it before. He called it Morris's. Now, this was a good thing for Washington and Mount Vernon business-wise, and so he promoted other enslaved people into management as well. So that by the time George Washington went off to the Continental Congress in 1774, much of what was running at Mount Vernon was Black supervised. there was no question in his mind that Morris and the other African American managers were every bit as good as the white guys who came and went, who abused his trust, who stole his equipment, who ran roughshod over his enslaved workers. Morris did the job. Now, this didn't work out for Washington during the Revolutionary War because of the economic hard times. The United States, when they declared war against, rose up and declared independence from Great Britain, they broke up with their creditors. They broke up with their markets. They broke up with their economic lifeline. And so there were hard times at Mount Vernon, but Morris and Hanna managed their way through it. Washington trusted him so much that when the British threatened to come up the Potomac River, he hid his valuables, his rum, his good stuff over at Morris's place because he trusted him so much. And then when a British sloop of war, the HMS Savage, came up the Potomac River, they blew up a Patriots plantation across the river in Maryland. They sailed across, trained their guns on Mount Vernon and said, hey, any enslaved person who wants to come and join the British, come on down. And by the way, we want food. We want supplies. And so Morris was tasked with giving the British those supplies. So go ahead.
No, I was going to say, when you hear and you read these stories, everyone, please purchase this book. We have part of financial education is financial history education. But you think, well, how could these people treat these people, Black people, African Americans, in this way? And then you write in the book that the enslavers' justification for unpaid labor for their entire lives was claiming that raising enslaved workers until at least age 15 was a financial investment, and their first 8 years of adult work merely repaid their upbringing. This was a rationalization. Mm-hmm. They were doing the Black workers a favor.
Correct. And so this was the accounting. Now it was fake accounting because by the time George Washington got a hold of Morris, he hadn't paid anything for his training. And Morris had already, if you want to say what's the value of your work versus the value of the quote unquote investment in food and training and clothing and medical care and shelter, Morris had paid that off by the time he was about 20. And so he was just earning a profit for the Custis family. He earned a profit for Washington over his lifetime. And Washington repaid that with token payments, £2, 10 pence at Christmas time or whatever the equivalent was. But it wasn't enough to save. And so Morris and Hanna could maybe buy a length of cloth, buy some strings for an instrument, buy a new tobacco pipe. But they couldn't save that stipend. And so when Morris died at age 66 in 1795, they buried him in the dirt in the farm that he had superintended for 20 years, and that was it. Hanna was recorded as past labor, and what was recorded in the books makes me think that she had a chronic illness like hypertension that may have led to dementia or some disability. And she may have been freed by George Washington's will in 1799. He freed 123 people. But since Morris was property of Martha and the Custis estate, Martha Washington never contemplated freeing any bondspeople. And so only a fraction of those people enslaved at Mount Vernon ever saw the light of freedom. And if Hanna did, it was probably as someone who needed care, rather than somebody who could enjoy freedom as an independent woman after being enslaved for 40 years by George Washington. At his death, 93% of the residents of Mount Vernon were enslaved. And Washington and Martha enslaved about 577 African Americans over their long career. And so we think, okay, well, here's Washington. Maybe he comes around to thinking slavery's not a great idea, but he never gave anything back. I mean, he willed all of his property to the Custis heirs or Washington heirs, whether it's land or cash, stocks, valuables. Nothing went to African Americans except for his personal valet, William or Billy Lee, who suffered a debilitating injury in Washington's service. So he freed exactly one person in his lifetime.
And let's just be clear who George Washington was.
Oh yes, the first president of the United States.
Okay.
Right?
Let's be clear.
Right, if you got a dollar bill in your pocket, take it out and gaze at George Washington. He's got kind of a sour smile, and part of that was that he had
okay, go ahead.
really severe dental problems, and he paid for the teeth of Black donors, and we don't know to the extent to which they've donated those teeth voluntarily.
All right. And then Mount Vernon, let's also be clear, this was the mansion that Morris and other enslaved Black workers built. It's still standing, at least the bones, and it's currently used as a wedding venue, everybody. How insulting. How insulting. In the interest of time, please, everyone, purchase this book, but I definitely would like to touch on the Underground Railroad and Mary Bentley and her descendants to Canada. And everyone, please read about Harriet and Jack Adams in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and their advocacy, members in fighting for civic and economic rights there with members of the NAACP, created a home for so-called colored girls, etc. But could you talk about Mary Bentley and her descendants in the Underground Railroad in Canada? We don't talk about that area of the country much.
Yes. So Martha Bentley was the daughter of Harriet. Harriet had been promised freedom in Maryland in the early part of the 19th century, and then was kidnapped by and sold to a Georgia planter named John Martin. Martin had children with Harriet, probably not consensually. One of those children was Martha. Martha grew up on a cotton plantation in Georgia and was moved around quite a bit. Now, the wife, Eliza Julia Martin, didn't like this. And so, there was no divorce statute in Georgia at the time. And so the deal was get rid of them. That is, get rid of your children by enslaved women. So because Georgia also didn't sanction Black freedom at the time, John Martin hired a cart, hired a driver, and drove Martha Bentley up to Cincinnati, Ohio, where he dropped her off with a quote unquote caregiver, gave her enough money for the caregiver, enough money for clothes and shoes and school. He went back to Georgia and died. So Harriet Bentley is now in Cincinnati, Ohio, one of the fastest growing cities in the early United States. This is around 1840, 1841. It's also a place of tremendous violence against Black middle-class citizens who showed by their strivings that they too could participate in this growing U.S. economy. And so in 1829, again in 1841, Martha Bentley probably saw the mobs descend on the First Ward in Cincinnati. But she's growing up in this environment where there's tremendously constrained opportunities, especially for Black women. And so she could have a choice of professions as a seamstress, as a washerwoman, as someone who scrubbed floors and emptied toilets. She didn't want that. So she took advantage of the Underground Railroad as a teenager and made it to Canada. And so this was what they called Canada West at the time, now Ontario, was a series, if you can imagine, dots of villages and communities on that plain where African American expatriates came together for mutual support to try and make a living away from the slave catchers, away from the kidnappers in the United States. Because even though she was, nominally free in Ohio, the laws of Georgia followed her to Ohio. So if anybody caught her, if any of the heirs caught her and said, "Oh, you're actually property of the Martin family," she couldn't really contest that. So in Canada, she met another fugitive from enslavement, Henry Goings. They married and had 5 children. Those children, 4 out of those 5 children crossed back into the United States. All 5 crossed back in the United States, but 4 of them landed in Grand Rapids, Michigan, eventually. And that's where the story takes a turn, because here was a place where in the 1870s, if you wanted to pick one place in the United States where you could conceivably have all the opportunities of the new industrial economy, a place that did not have a history of enslavement, a place that was thoroughly Republican at a time when the Republicans were for expanding the franchise, for the opportunity of African Americans, right, to compete on a level playing field. But the book tells the story of this branch of the Goings family who did the hard work, who put in the hard work, but that yielded diminishing returns, as so many avenues to uplift in this industrial economy were closed because the factories didn't hire Black workers. The design industry didn't hire African Americans. There was discrimination in schools, discrimination in lending. And then after all that, the real estate industry started to turn on them and box them into this one corner of Southeast Grand Rapids. When the Goings family arrived in the 1870s and 1880s, they could and did live anywhere they wanted. They could buy real estate. And Michigan at the time was beckoning not only Americans from the East Coast, they were saying, hey, you Canadians, you French, you Dutch, come to Michigan, work in our industries. And this was the center of the furniture and industrial design industry, the first place in the United States with a multi-user hydroelectric power plant. I mean, this was ground zero for the American Industrial Revolution. Many cities shared that distinction, but then by the early 20th century, the Adams family, the Goings family, found themselves ghettoized in a corner of Grand Rapids that federal policies dovetailed with local prejudices to create an enclave of concentrated African American poverty. Mm-hmm. And so it's a story of tragedy because they played by the rules. They did the hard work. Minnie Goings, one of the subjects, had her own business, and she opened several locations for this business. The Goings men, they went to work. They tried to move up the ladder, but they found that ceiling, that career ceiling, very low. Mm-hmm. In a place where you had people like Gerald R. Ford, President of the United States, who went to school with one of the Goings, James Goings. Mm-hmm. But Goings got his high school diploma, and the only thing he could do was wait tables. Gerald Ford got his high school diploma, and they said, well, go to the University of Michigan, play some football there, go to Yale Law School, come back, practice law, go into politics, these sorts of things. And so it's the story of, again, the idea that you're overcoming one set of obstacles only to see another set of obstacles spring up in its place.
So, Professor, let's talk about solutions. There's someone listening saying this was in the 1600s, the 1700s. Black people have Oprah and Michael Jackson or Jordan or any of those Michaels. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps and stop just living in the past. Professor, you would say what?
I'm glad that you mentioned bootstraps. And this takes me back to a speech that Martin Luther King Jr. made in many forms, and it's very powerful. He said, no ethnic group in the United States has risen by their own bootstraps. And he pointed to things like homesteading, the massive giveaway of land, of federal land. He could point to things like Farm Aid. The federal government got involved in helping farmers in the early 20th century. Guess what? They helped white farmers, but not Black farmers. White families got homesteading land. Black families tended not to. White families got FHA, federal loan guarantees on new property. Black families got excluded from those neighborhoods.
GI Bills.
And the GI Bill created the middle class. And you say, well, there's nothing written in the GI Bill that's racist. True, but the architects knew that if they could have local agents, pushing the white GIs off to college, the black GIs off to a vocational school. What's the value of an engineering degree from the University of Pennsylvania versus a brick making course at a veterans college? That's a pretty big kind of income gap. So what Dr. King said was, you can tell a man to raise himself up by his bootstraps. It's a cruel jest to tell a bootless man to raise himself by his bootstraps. And so what he's suggesting is level the playing field, right? Try to at least include African Americans in those opportunities that have been freebies for white Americans for generations. And so the takeaway is, we have a lot of discussion around DEI today, most of it negative. What's the metric of success? I suggest the metric of success is wealth equality, maybe secondarily income equality. If there's a gap in income with an apples to apples comparison, again, a white male wages, black female wages, once they're aligned, we can get rid of DEI, right? What about the wealth gap? When that's equalized, currently, depending on the measure, it's either 15 or 16 to 1. That is for every I'm sorry, not 15 or 16 to 1. It's about 8 times. So for every dollar a typical white household has, a typical African-American household has about 16 cents. That should be the measure of success, not the perception of unfairness. Because if we look back at the history of this, and the economist Laura Derenoncourt has this beautiful kind of like economic visualization of this. Between 1930 and 1960, the wealth gap shrank at about 1% a year. During civil rights, the era of civil rights, it started to shrink at about 1.5% a year. Now, that's some slow growth, slow convergence, but at least we'd be on the path to equality. This diverged again in the 1980s, excuse me, 1980s, when the policies that came out of deregulation, of supply side economics, of cutting taxes on high earners, and gutting labor legislation, the wealth gap started to widen again. Mm-hmm. And so what can we do based on our empirical data, based on what we know about what tends towards equity, is to adopt those policies that someone like Dr. King would recommend, right? Take your boot off the neck of people who are seeking opportunity. Mm-hmm. And for all this talk about, DEI is harming white people, it doesn't harm white people. In fact, most of the beneficiaries of affirmative action in DEI are white women. Mm-hmm. So we saw in the 1970s that African-American women's wages almost converged with white women's, and then diverged again in the 80s and ever since. Right. So that could be a conversation, a national conversation we could have. And we've seen in the last few weeks, this is all on this sort of frontal assault on what's called DEI, which is reduced to this rhetorical name calling. But if you look behind it, look at the structural inequities, right? That's what we need to address. And we need to address them through legislation that levels the field, that guarantees fair practices, that takes the biases out of AI when AI is trained on, right, racist data. And what I mean by that is that you can't get a job, you can't rent a home without a credit check. And if credit checks have some inequities built into them, right, at credit reporting, then we have to look at that. And so what the book suggests as far as steps towards solutions is to look at those laws and practices that tend to widen equality and work to rectify that.
So who do you think would be a receptive audience for you? You can call anyone. Who would you like to speak to right now that you think that will warmly receive your proposal in this climate in 2025?
This is an interesting question, because California in the last several years has had a task force on reparations. And that task force has gone through and done the math and done the hard work of saying, what is it that has created wealth inequities and divergence in California? And it's like an 800 or 900 page report. Mm-hmm. But I would like to speak to legislators who may have a superficial idea of what diversity, equity, and inclusion means, and actually have them look behind the rhetoric and see what are the realities.
Right, and that legislation or that proposal was given the kibosh by Governor Newsom, would not allow it to move forward.
Yes, and that's unfortunate, because I would encourage any California or any state legislator to read that, any national legislator to read that. And so I think a receptive audience should be anybody who takes these issues of inequity or inequality seriously, who wants to get beneath the nasty rhetoric around this, which says that, oh, this just boils down to Black people trying to get something that they didn't earn. Because if I look back at my own family's wealth history, there's a lot of Uncle Sam putting a thumb on the scale in favor of my ancestors. This is not true. This would not be true if I had been born Black. Mm. And so if we think about that, maybe we can turn the page on this discussion.
Final question: how does America benefit by continuing its policies that widen the racial wealth gap, that continue to keep them in place?
I don't think anyone benefits in the long run.
How does America think because someone must think everything is wonderful. How would America say, this is fine, everything's fine, relax?
Yes. So if you've got another hour, we can try to approach the issue of deep-seated racism. But here's something that the book tries to take issue with. The market is not self-correcting. The free market is one in which the history is with us, right? Every dollar has a history. The theft of dollars have a history too. And so we can't automatically think that, if we just remove the regulation, remove the restraints, we remove this, the growth will emerge, that everyone will benefit from this. This hasn't been true over 400 years of American history because of the jurisprudence of those Virginia courts, because of the predatory nature of those New England enslavers who wrung cash out of Venture Smith for years and years and years. Mm-hmm. It's not true because of the legacy of Morris's family versus the Washington family, how wealth is concentrated in these ways.
Mm-hmm. Everyone, for a deep dive, and you have to have it, because it will cause you to reflect on your own family's history and to start to prepare or to accelerate your own generational financial security at minimum and generational wealth. Here's the book. Author of The Plunder of Black America, How the Racial Wealth Gap Was Made. I've been honored to have a conversation with all of you and Professor Calvin Schermerhorn, Arizona State history professor. Thank you so much for joining us here at Planet Wekeza.
Thank you, Sabrina. It's been wonderful.